الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In last week's lesson we were looking at the topic of Qurbani and Udhiyah, and I mentioned that Qurbani is one of those obligations in Islam where we are remembering something which one of our pious predecessors, or in other words Sayyiduna Ibrahim alayhi salam, did. And I also mentioned upon whom Qurbani is wajib, and I also mentioned upon whose behalf would a person give Qurbani for. And I also mentioned the timings of Qurbani in terms of if the Qurbani animal is in a village, then the time of Qurbani is after the beginning of Fajr. So as soon as Fajr time starts, that's when the Qurbani of that particular animal will be performed. And if the Qurbani animal is in a city, and I mentioned that the time of Qurbani is as soon as the Imam finishes the Eid prayer. So as soon as he gives salam to the right and the left and finishes the Eid prayer, so you don't even have to wait for the khutbah, because in Eid you have the salah first and the khutbah afterwards. So you don't even have to wait for the Imam to finish the khutbah. As soon as he finishes the Eid salah, then that is the time for the Qurbani. That is the time when an animal can be lawfully slaughtered for that person's Qurbani to be done if the Qurbani animal is in a city. Now what we're going to do in today's lesson is just look at some other aspects of Qurbani, some other rulings with regards to the Qurbani animal. In particular, what type of animals you can give for Qurbani, how old do these animals have to be, and also some rules with regards to the distributing of the Qurbani meat. Now one thing to clarify here is that Qurbani is not for the consuming of the meat. Many people are under this impression that, let's give a big fat juicy cow for Qurbani so we could have more meat. Let's give a big fat goat or sheep for Qurbani so that we can have nice meat and so on. Qurbani is never and has never ever been about the meat. So what is Qurbani for? Now Qurbani, the reason why we do Qurbani is to follow the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to create taqwa and to create piety within ourselves. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says in the Quran, لَن يَنَالَ اللَّهَ لُحُومُهَا وَلَا دِمَاؤُهَا وَلَكِنْ يَنَالُهُ التَّقْوَى مِنْكُمْ. That when you do the slaughtering, the meat doesn't reach Allah, the flesh doesn't reach Allah, but what reaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is those people by abiding and by following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they have reached taqwa, and that taqwa, that piety, that God-fearingness, that reaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is not in need of the meat. Allah is not in need whether you sacrifice a big cow or a smaller, thinner cow. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need that whether you sacrifice a fat, juicy goat or sheep or a skinny goat or a sheep. No, the whole idea is to follow the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the reason why, now you may be thinking, what's command got to do with here? Because the reason why is that Qurbani is one of those obligations which logically doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, Qurbani. That's why even nowadays as well, when you speak to some Muslim brothers about Qurbani, they say, why do we give Qurbani for? Why can't I just give Sadaqah instead? Instead of killing the animal, instead of, some people come out with words such as, or instead of oppressing the animal, why don't I give the value of a goat or a cow or a sheep to the poor? That would be far more better than sacrificing the cow or the goat and giving the meat to the poor. So remember, this is something which doesn't make sense logically. But that is the whole purpose of this obligation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made Qurbani obligatory so that He can test whether that person would be doing it or not. The exact same situation happened with Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, that when he saw the dream that he was sacrificing his own son. So Ibrahim alayhi salam couldn't understand that how can I sacrifice my own son? But he did not think, he did not mutter, he did not say or raise any objections, oh Allah, why am I sacrificing my own son? But instead he abided by the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being the most merciful, being Ar-Rahman, being the most affectionate, He is the most compassionate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not let Ibrahim alayhi salam sacrifice and slaughter his own son. But it was a test from Allah to see how much love Ibrahim alayhi salam, how much Ibrahim alayhi salam was willing to sacrifice his dunya, his family, his other things for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the exact same thing we can see when it comes to the Qurbani. That Qurbani, remember, is never ever been about the meat. It's never ever been about how much meat you can get. It's never ever been about the size of the cow or the size of the goat or the sheep. But it's about how a person is abiding by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command, and how a person brings taqwa and love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his life. Now moving along, the next ruling to mention about the Qurbani is what types of animals a person can sacrifice for his Qurbani to be valid. How old do they have to be? And what types of animals he can't sacrifice. Now in general, there are three types of animals you sacrifice for Qurbani. They are either number one, cows, number two, camels, or number three, goat and sheep. So these are in general 3-4 animals you sacrifice for Qurbani. Cows, camels, big animals, or smaller animals such as goats and sheep. Any other animals like chickens, deers and so on, they would not be sufficient for the Qurbani to be done. Also, another important ruling with regards to when it comes to the animals is that how old do the animals, what's the minimum age of the animal before you can sacrifice them. So the scholars have mentioned that a camel has to be at least 5 years old. So when it comes to sacrificing camel, the camel has to be at least 5 years old. A cow has to be at least 2 years old, and a goat or a sheep has to be at least 1 year old. So that is like the minimum age. A camel which is less than 5 years old and is sacrificed, a person's Qurbani will not be done. A cow less than 2 years old, that person's Qurbani would not be done. Goat, sheep, if they're like 6 months, 7 months old, less than a year, Qurbani will not be done. Now the reason I'm mentioning it is, like I mentioned last week, that a lot of kind of scams and schemes happen when it comes to Qurbani, in particular with regards to the timings. I was explaining to the brothers last week that sometimes they'll, like if you're living in the city, they should sacrifice the Qurbani animal after the Imam does the Eid Salah. But we find many butchers that 9 o'clock on Eid day, they'll have the Qurbani meat ready, which is kind of implying that they must have done the Zabah and the sacrifice 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and then they're getting the meat cut and packed for you ready at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now another kind of scam which happens, which again many of our brothers don't actually realize, is regarding the age of the Qurbani animal. That we just give the Qurbani, we just give the money to the butcher to sacrifice a goat or a sheep. But what we also have to make sure is that the animals which are being sacrificed, their age has to be the correct one as well. If it's like a baby 3-4 month old animal or a 3-4 month old goat, your Qurbani will not be done. If you're sacrificing a cow and the cow only happens to be a year old, your Qurbani will not be done. So that's like another thing which we need to bear in mind, is that the animals which we are sacrificing for Qurbani, we have to make sure that they have reached the exact, the correct, the appropriate age for the qurbani to be valid, for the qurbani to be done. Now this then takes me on to the next point here about qurbani. In particular, the distributing of the meat. Who should the meat go to? Now at the very beginning of Islam, the order or the command of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was that as soon as qurbani is done, you have a 3-day limit of consuming the meat. So you had to consume the meat within 3 days. If, say, for example, you couldn't consume it within 3 days, then that meat would become haram to consume. And this is actually very, very different to what it was at the very beginning of Islam. Because at the very beginning of Islam, when you sacrifice, when you do qurbani, you weren't allowed to eat it at all. I'm sure everybody knows the story of Habil and Qabil, who were the sons of Adam alayhi salam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Adam alayhi salam to convey to his sons Habil and Qabil, that Habil, you have to marry Qabil's twin, and Qabil has to marry Habil's twin. But if you remember, Qabil didn't want to marry Habil's twin sister, because she wasn't that pretty. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then ordered Adam alayhi salam to tell them to offer a sacrifice, offer a qurbani. So if you remember that Habil sacrificed the most expensive goat, the most expensive animal, he sacrificed it and he left it on top of the mountain. Whereas Qabil just had a bit of, he got a few grains and a few rice here and there, and he left it on top of the mountain. So in those days, what would happen is that for qurbani to be accepted or not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send a asmani ag, a heavenly fire. So the heavenly fire came and he ate up the qurbani of Habil, the expensive goat which he sacrificed, whereas the sacrifice which Qabil did, the asmani ag, the heavenly fire, did not come to eat that away, which was kind of indicating that Habil's sacrifice was correct, whereas Qabil wasn't. So what I'm trying to say is that before Islam, when you sacrificed the animal, no one was allowed to eat it. Asmani ag would come and just burn that, and that was a sign that Allah has accepted it. So in Islam, it's like a ni'mat, a blessing, a khususiyat of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and this ummah, that at the very beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed the Muslims to consume their qurbani meat, but they only had a 3-day period to do it. But obviously later on in Islam, that rule was slightly made flexible, and there was some leeway in terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed that if you can't consume within 3 days, then obviously you can store it and then keep the qurbani meat and you can eat it whenever. So there's no now kind of time limit of consuming your qurbani meat, especially nowadays with freezers and fridges, that if you were to pack your qurbani meat and if you were to consume it, say 1 year later or 2 years later, as long as it's fresh, then that is allowed and that is permissible. But at the very beginning of Islam, you only had 3 days to consume the qurbani meat. Now going back to the question which I posed, is that how do you distribute the qurbani meat? Who do you give it to? Now the scholars have mentioned that it is mustahab or desirable to distribute the meat into 3 parts. Again, you don't have to do it, but it is mustahab to distribute it into 3 parts. The first part should be for one's personal use. In other words, for himself, you could say for his family, children, wife, and so on. Then the second part should be for relatives and friends, cousins. And then the third part of the qurbani meat should be given to the poor and the needy. So there are 3 ways, or the qurbani meat should be distributed into 3 parts. First for himself, for his family. Second for his cousins, relatives, friends. And then lastly, the third part should be for the poor and the needy. Now, as I already explained, that this way of distributing the meat is considered to be mustahab and desirable. So just say, for example, if somebody keeps the meat all for himself, then that is also allowed. If somebody, say for example, doesn't want to keep it all for himself, but he wants to give it out to, say, just family and friends, that will also be allowed as well. Like is mentioned the hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would sacrifice any animals, the meat he would not keep for himself, but instead what he would do is that he would give it to the friends of Hazrat Khadija radhiyallahu anha. And from there the ulamas have derived that whenever there's a bereavement in your family, whenever a father or a mother passes away, one of the rights or the hukuks of your parents or your mother or your father is that after they passed away, you also keep connection with the friends of your father. You also keep that kind of love and affection with the friends of your mother. So exactly here that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Hazrat Khadija anha passed away, he would sacrifice and then he would give the meat not to himself, not to his own wives, because there were 9 of them, so he could have given it out to all of his wives, but no, instead he would give it to the friends of Hazrat Khadija anha. And from this we can understand that whenever we sacrifice, or even nowadays as well, whenever we have some extra food, sometimes there could be a wedding or some kind of function and we've got some extra food, so we should give it out to the neighbors, but also keeping this hadith in mind, give it out to those who our parents who may not be with us anymore, to those people who had connection with our parents, those friends, those you could say old people, the elder members of the community who come to the masjid, who they knew our father. We should also look after them as well. We should also give them food. We should also invite them whenever there's a kind of family function we have. Because sometimes, like just say later on, our sisters or our daughters get married, then we should also invite those who our father had connection with. It shouldn't be just like keep the invitation just to family and friends and that's it. But those people who knew our fathers, those people who knew our mothers, we should also give them an invite as well. So that is one of the hukuks and rights of our parents after they pass away. So the same way they have many hukuks and rights when they are alive, but also when they pass away, they also have many hukuks as well. One is, as I explained, looking after their friends, their associates. We look after them, have that connection and link with them. But also more importantly, we should do dua for them as well. That's one of the rights our parents have after they pass away. As mentioned in the hadith that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, because whenever somebody passes away and they're in the next life, the barzakh life, they are always waiting for people to go and visit them in the graves. It's mentioned in the hadith of Tabrani that the dwellers of the grave, they're like sad by themselves in the grave. No one's coming to visit them. But then what happens is that when somebody goes to visit them, and the same way in this dunya, that just say if somebody was alone at home and you go and visit them and you give them a kind of a box of chocolate, they get so happy, or you buy some biscuits and they get so happy. When our relatives or someone passed away, they are in the grave and we go and visit them, but we give them a gift. And what greater gift is than doing dua for them in front of their graves or reciting one verse of the Holy Quran? That is mentioned that when you do that and you send Isal al-Thawab to them, then they get really happy in the grave. It like makes their entire day up. The same way somebody's alone at home and you go and visit them and they get so happy, and it makes the entire day, the entire week, just that 2-3 minutes somebody comes and visit them, that keeps them on for the next couple of weeks or 3 weeks. That adrenaline keeps them on. So exactly same with the deceased as well, that you go and visit their graves, you do dua for them, you send a bit of Isal al-Thawab in terms of Quran recitation, Surah Yasin, Surah Mulk, as mentioned in the hadith, Surah Mulk and Surah Sajda, they intercede for the person in the grave. So by reading these few surahs to them, then the thawab and the reward they get, it saves them from the punishment of the grave, and also keeps them happy and the barakah in the grave for the coming weeks, for the coming months, until the next time somebody comes and meets them and reads something to them. So as I was saying, So as I was saying that when it comes to the distribution of the meat, that it should be given to these three types of people. Now, one or two more rulings before we finish the program. A common question people ask is that should we sacrifice or have a share for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when it comes to Qurbani? So the answer is that it is desirable or praiseworthy to allocate a share for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when it comes to Qurbani. You don't have to, but it is praiseworthy and it is recommended. Why? Because as mentioned in the hadith of Tirmizi, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he also sacrificed a share of Qurbani for this particular ummah as well. Now, one final point I want to mention here is regarding the skin of the Qurbani animal. So I've already talked about the meat, that the meat should be distributed amongst the three types of people. But what should we do with regards to the skin of the Qurbani animal? Now, this is quite important because what nowadays happens is that the butchers who do the Qurbani, they keep the skin with them, where in reality that is actually incorrect. Now, the scholars have mentioned that when you sacrifice an animal, a Qurbani animal, even the skin of the Qurbani animal is also part of the meat. In other words, the same way you distribute that to the family, friends and the poor, so the exact same thing should happen with the skin as well. So you get the skin of the Qurbani animal, the hooves of the Qurbani animal, the horns of the Qurbani animal, and you also distribute that out to the poor and the needy. Now, as I was explaining, that nowadays the butchers, they keep the skin with them. Now, what should we do in this day and age with with this issue, because the butchers are keeping the skin? Now, what we should do is that because they keep the skin and they don't give it to us, what we should do is that we should give a bit more extra sadaqah to the poor and to the needy to compensate the skin which they haven't given to us, which they are keeping. Because the thing is that nowadays, if we do take the skin, we can't really do anything with it. In the past, it was considered very important, the skin, because they would take the skin, they would dry it, they would tan it, they would make it into rugs and so on. But that is not the case in this day and age. So therefore, what we should do is that we should actually, because the butchers are not giving the skin, but that is also a very important part of our Qurbani. So what we should then do, and what is more praiseworthy, is that just give an extra £5-10 to the poor and sadaqah, to the poor, to the needy as sadaqah, which will compensate for the Qurbani skin which we haven't received when we were sacrificing the Qurbani animal. Inshallah, just leave it there, as there is a program. So when Allah the tawfiq to act on been said. Inshallah, next week's lesson, there's one or two more rulings about Qurbani animal which we'll cover. Then afterwards, we'll touch on the next topic, which is about Aqiqah, which is also linked with the Qurbani and sacrificing and so on. May Allah the tawfiq to act on been said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah.